Hello everyone. In this lesson, we are going to learn about lists as a data structure in R. By the end of this lesson, you will learn how to create lists in R. Recall that the basic data structures in R are vectors, lists, matrices, arrays, and data frames. So a list is a data structure that allows you to store different data types. And if you remember the data types that we've covered, that includes numeric, integer, character, logical, and complex. Lists can also store other data structures. Now, while matrices, arrays, and data frames are yet to be discussed, it is important to note that lists can also store these data structures. Since we've already covered vectors, we will be creating lists mainly using vectors. So if you want to create a list in R, you use the list function. Now, when you use the list function and pass in elements, each element of the list can be of any data type. But over here, as shown on the screen, first list, second list are simply placeholders for those elements. So when you execute this code, you will observe that the first element is actually assigned an index. That is the double square bracket with the number 1 in there, identifying the first list. That is to say that the first list contains a vector with only one item, and that item is first list. The second list is also identifiable with a double square bracket with a number 2 in there, and that also contains a vector of one item, and that item is second list. So you can go on with any other elements that you want to pass into the list to create as many lists as you want. So at this point, we will go into RStudio and learn how to create lists. Now, let us go ahead and create a basic list with 3 numbers. So in this case, we will use the list function, and then in there, we pass the elements which we want to use to create the list. So I would just want to start with something very simple. I will just pass 1, 2, 3. And then what I'm going to do right now is just simply to execute this line of code. And remember, you can click on Run button at the top here, or you can simply press Control Enter. So let's go ahead and run this code. Now, when you execute this code, you'll observe the output right here. So first of all, you should observe the double square bracket with the number 1 in there. That is simply telling you that is the first list. And within this first list, we also have a vector with only one item, and that item is simply the number 1. Again, we also have the second list, which is identifiable by the double square brackets with a number 2 in there, and that also contains a vector with only one number, and that number is 2. And this also happens to be the third list, containing a vector with only one number. Now let's go ahead, and this time, just as we mentioned before, lists can store different data types. So what I'm going to do right now is just simply to have a character data type. So let's use my name, which is Elijah, in quote, and then separated by comma, let me use my surname, which is simply Appiah. And let's simply go ahead and have another number like 100, and let's add a logical value, which is true. So if I go ahead, first of all, let me clear the console. If I go ahead and execute this line of code, you will then observe that the first element of the list, Elijah, is going to belong to the very first list. So we have the first list containing a vector of only one item, which is my name, Elijah, my first name. We also have the second list containing my surname, the third list containing the number 100, and the fourth list containing a logical constant or a logical value. So you can see that list at this point in time is able to hold different data types, where we have the character data type, we have a numeric data type, and then we have the logical data type. Now, let us go ahead and expand this idea by creating a list where each element is a vector. So at this point, I can now begin to give names or assign my list to particular objects that I want to name. So at this point, let me just go ahead and name it list of vectors. And at this point, I'm using the snake casing method. And then I am going to initiate my list function. So in that, I'm going to pass the elements. But now, instead of one specific element being passed to the list function, I am now going to pass vectors. So I'm going to begin with the first vector, which is going to be a vector of numbers. So let me go ahead and pass in some arbitrary set of numbers. So we should have 23, 89, 10, 7, 11, 15, 12, 5. And then we will now bring our comma. So it means that this entire vector is going to be the very first element of the list that we are creating. So we'll go ahead and pass the second vector, and I am going to go ahead and pass integers. So let's go ahead and say 100L, comma, 34L, and let's say negative 90L. And I'm going to pass the third vector. Now, at this point, you would observe that my elements that I'm placing into the list function is getting longer. So there is a much more convenient way of doing this. So what I'm going to do is, let's go ahead and cut this out of the list function. And whilst the parenthesis is actually empty and the cursor is blinking right in there, I am going to press enter on my keyboard, and you would observe that it pushes it to the next line with some sort of indentation. This makes your code much cleaner. So let me go ahead and paste what I just cut before, and then right here, I will also press enter to bring it to the next line with that same indentation coming before it. So I will go ahead and now add about 3 more vectors. Now, if you observe what I have just simply done, I have only put in vectors of the various data types. So we have a vector of numeric values, we have a vector of integers, we have a vector of characters, a vector of logical values, and then a vector of complex data type. So each data type is being represented here within the list. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all this part of the code and then simply execute. Now, once I have finished executing, I will go ahead and print the list of vectors to the console, and we see what happens. So once we print our object list of vectors into the console, you now observe that we have the very first list containing the vector of numeric data type. So we have numbers here. We have the second list also containing integers. We have the third list containing character data type. We have the fourth list containing the logical data type, and the fifth list containing the complex data types. So this is to show you that lists can actually store the different data types that we mentioned before. It is also important to note that lists can also contain other lists, allowing you to create what is called list of lists. So for example, let us go ahead and create an object called nested list, and then we initiate our list function, open our parenthesis, press enter to indent it, and then within it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create list of lists. But before that, let me just go ahead and pass in the vector, and we know exactly what is going to happen. So this vector will belong to the very first list once we go ahead and print this object after we have created the list. So I'm going to go ahead and just pass in some numbers. So let's say we have 12, we have 9, 80, and then for the second element of that list, which is going to be for the second list, I will just simply go ahead and create another list. And then within that, I am also going to pass another set of vectors. So essentially, what we have done here is to create a list where the first list is going to be a vector of 3 numbers. And then within this list, we also have another list containing 2 vectors. One is going to be the vector of character data type, which is actually naming the basic data structures that we have in R. And then the second vector would also be a vector of logical values. So we would go ahead and execute this code. And let's go ahead and print this nested list to the console and see how the output looks. So over here, we now have our first list, which is going to contain the vector of 3 numbers. And then we have our second list. Now within our second list, we also have the first list. So we have a repetition of this second list identifier over here. This one here tells you that is the first list within the second major list. And this is also the second list within the second major list. So that's exactly what we have done here. So at this point, you would see that, well, this is actually complex and you may not be going that far in your programming journey, but one thing for sure is that you can do awesome things in R. You own it, so use it.